Hey guys, and welcome back to the fourth episode in my Historic NASA Missions KSP series. Our mission for this episode is going to be Gemini 4, the second manned Gemini mission, and the first US mission that featured extravehicular activity. Sorry for the delay on this video. I've had a pretty bad cough and a cold for more or less the whole week, and I had all the video shot for the episode and everything, and I only just recovered well enough to not be like hacking a cough the entire audio track. But never mind that, because the series is back and it's going to be better than ever. If you've been following my Absolute Beginner's Guide to KSP videos, you'll note that the black lines that were in the Friendship 7 video, those have been fixed. I switched to a new video editor, and I hadn't at that point quite worked out the kinks before I uploaded episode 3, and it actually rendered wrong. Hopefully the video is also better, tweaking a little bit more in my audio editor, so hopefully that'll be a little bit clearer. And we're also going to save a little bit of time by jumping right into the mission parameters instead of going over the history. We're going to go over some of that later. Number one parameter is obviously that the spacecraft design in KSP has to be similar to the real Gemini capsule and the Titan launch vehicle designs, and I'm going to get to that during the construction. Number two is again that the orbit has to be similar. In the case of Gemini 4, the capsule had an initial orbit that was 161 kilometers by 283 kilometers. So this gets translated into a goal KSP orbit of 113 kilometers by 198 kilometers. I just want to note, in case anybody's been wondering why I'm translating it the way I am into KSP altitudes. The reason is that by multiplying it in order to get it past the sort of Kerbal carbon line, the Kerbal end of the atmosphere, it's basically just multiplication. So that keeps the eccentricity of the orbit exactly the same as it would have been for the initial original orbit. Now, the number three parameter is that after the circularization burn, and still during the first orbit, we're going to attempt to do a rendezvous with the second stage of the launch vehicle, just like Gemini 4 did. Gemini 4 was not successful. We'll see if I'm successful or not. Then finally, actually, not finally, number 4 is that on the third orbit, we're going to have both of the Kerbals that are in the spacecraft do an EVA. That's going to be followed by a few more orbits. We're not going to be doing all of the actual 62 Gemini orbits. We're going to cut it a little bit short. And then finally, the fifth parameter is that we're going to re-enter the atmosphere with chutes and try to land in the ocean to the east of Kerbal Space Center for rescue. Okay, so this is the creation of my rough draft, just like all my other rough drafts. And I decided to start off with the Gemini capsule itself. The Gemini capsule actually had pretty much 5 sections on it, and they were modular, so it actually made it way easier to repair and swap in and out parts and so on, unlike the Mercury capsule, and actually unlike Russian designs too, to some degree. So the top section, I'm obviously using the 3-man capsule. That's going to change in my final design, but I decided to start off trying to use the 3-man capsule, and then I ended up having one of the Kerbals suicide to his death on the launch pad, so only 2 went up, just like the Gemini program. But the very top section in the Gemini capsule was the rendezvous and recovery section, and it basically just had a radar for rendezvous on the later missions, and then it also had a drogue parachute for the initial part of the re-entry, and it also had a main parachute for the main part of the re-entry. And then it had the like you see I'm putting on there, the components for docking. So I kind of wanted to keep this kind of standard for all the Gemini missions. I don't know how many I'm going to end up doing, probably just 1 or 2 more, and then I'm going to move on to Apollo. But I wanted to kind of keep it standard, so I did put on the docking part on this one, even though it's obviously not necessary for this particular mission. And what happened is that during re-entry, the Rendezvous and Recovery section fell off of the spacecraft. It was like separated by well, explosives, so that would be the KSP equivalent of that stack separator there. And then a small parachute pulled that section away from the actual spacecraft itself, and then it also deployed the main parachute at the same time. So I put those radial parachutes around the RCS part there, and I'm putting the kind of equivalent of the separation parachutes on there to blow at the same time as the stack separator. The next part down, you can see that I put on is the re-entry control system, which is RCS. Obviously in KSP it's reaction control system, and in real life more recently it's reaction control system. But that was basically, there were 16 thrusters, and there was also fuel on the inside for the thrusters in that section, which was more or less directly above the capsule itself. So I've got those thrusters on there. I decided to put the main parachutes on that section, but they weren't really in that section on the actual capsule. And then the middle section was obviously the actual interior cabin of the Gemini capsule, and it had pretty much just enough room for two guys to sit in there with a kind of minimal amount of equipment. They had to fit in their spacesuits, and they also had all the experiment equipment that they brought up with them, environment control systems, all the switches and boards and all that inside. And then beneath that is actually like an adapter for the retrograde, like the retro package. It pretty much had a retro package similar to what Mercury did, except it wasn't really strapped on to the bottom in the same manner that the Mercury capsule's retro package was. And then there were also maneuvering thrusters in that next like retrograde section. So you had the maneuvering thrusters for re-entry were on the top, but the actual like attitude control thrusters were on the bottom. So I've got two sets of thrusters there. And then there was an equipment section on the bottom that had like electrical equipment, fuel tanks, batteries, the actual fuel cells. The Gemini program was the first U.S. space mission to use fuel cells on its spacecraft. And that's pretty much the bottom. I put the ASAS in Kerbal Space Program to kind of simulate the electronics and all of that. And then on the bottom of that is pretty much my rendition of the Titan II launch vehicle. The Titan II was derived from yet another nuclear missile, and it was adapted for human spaceflight. I put the I forgot what it's called, but the Poodle, I think it's a Poodle, yeah, the Poodle engine. I put that on there because my intention was to have to try to stay at first to be similar, I guess, to what the actual engines were on the original Titan II launch vehicle. So the upper stage had a 445 kilonewton engine, a single one of those, and then they were on the first stage, or the bottom stage, it had two LR87 AJ7 engines, which had about 800 kilonewtons of thrust each. So you basically had two engines on the bottom that were about twice the thrust of the single engine on the tops, for about 4 times as much thrust in that bottom section. That did not end up being practical. You'll see here that I put these two Poodle engines on the bottom using those cubic strut pieces. They're kind of clipping there. Shout out to I guess Frafor, F-R-A-F-O-R, on Kerbal Space Program forums for suggesting this to help try to simulate the Titan II launch vehicle, but it really didn't end up working. You'll see in a second that I couldn't really get. It messed with the delta V to have the two engines on the bottom, and it also messed with like the stability and how much thrust there was. And even when I tried to use two different engines besides these Poodle ones on the bottom, it failed. So you can see that when I launch with the 2 Poodle engines and all this fuel, it does not take off from the ground. It doesn't do anything. So then I went back to the VAB and I swapped out those engines with the mainsail engines. So I got 2 mainsails on the bottom here, and then I'm going to go, see it's still clipping, it's kind of acting weird. And I used too big of structural pieces. But then I decided that since I was having problems with that, with even launching with that Poodle engine, I decided to swap out the top stage too. But then you'll see the result of that, which is that I get up to the end of my gravity turn pretty much, and you can see already how little fuel I have left. You can also see that the Separatrons have already fired. That's because I set up the staging wrong, but this was really just kind of a almost like a proof of concept to see if the actual engine and fuel configuration would actually work, not really a a final final mission. Okay, so this is my final draft. Really, the main differences are that instead of using the 3-man pod, I used the lander can. That saved on weight, and it also means that I don't have to have a Kerbal do a death jump on launch to keep it down to 2 Kerbals. And then the other main difference is that I'm just using 1 main engine on the bottom stage, and it's got some more fuel in it to make sure that both stages have enough delta V. It's really lumbers through the lower atmosphere, and you can see that it's wobbling pretty badly too because of the ASAS controlling it. But it gets there. It does get there. The actual launch of Gemini 4 was the first satellite broadcasted launch. They had launched a TV satellite up into orbit, and they used it to broadcast the launch of the. It wasn't specifically for the launch, but they used it to broadcast the launch, basically to the whole world. Soviets hadn't even really done that. The Soviets had, however, this was the first American mission to have an EVA, but the Soviets did beat us to an EVA. They found they knew that we were planning on doing an EVA, and they really didn't want us to beat them. So the communist leadership in the Soviet Union decided to really hastily modify the Vostok capsule that they had been using for orbital missions to be able to do an EVA, and they launched before Gemini 4 did and actually beat us to it. This is my circularization burn here, and you can see I don't have quite exactly enough to get to my goal altitude there, but it does go up to I think a reasonable amount. It goes to, you can see that that's the periapsis and the apoapsis there. That's pretty good, I think. It was only about 6 or 7 meters per second off from the delta V. And I'm just changing it to, because obviously it's using the lander can, thinks it's a lander, so I changed it to a capsule. For some reason, both of these scrub Kerbals that I'm using are terrified. I don't know why. Probably because of all the ones that had died from my test missions. But we're separated from the launch vehicle there, and I'm just gonna kind of try to get some separation from the launch vehicle. In reality, they were quite a bit more separated from the launch vehicle when they tried to rendezvous than I'm gonna be, but they didn't really know how separated they were from the launch vehicle because they had no like rendezvous radar on the Gemini 4 capsule like they did in later missions that were actually specifically for rendezvousing. So both of the pilots, McDivitt and White, they had differing guesstimations on how far away they were away from the launch vehicle section at any given point. So they really had they basically had no idea how far this thing was away from them. And part of the other problem was that nobody really knew how rendezvous physics worked really. So what would happen is that they would accelerate towards the target, which was the second stage of the launch vehicle, and they would end up going above it because as you're going faster, that increases the altitude of your orbit, and that's not really something that's very intuitive, and it's not really anything that they'd really trained for either. And then there was also problems with the fact that since it was a spent stage, it was getting rid of like the residual amount of fuel that it had left in it, so it was kind of it had its own physics issues with it changing from where they expected it to be, and it just they completely failed in trying to rendezvous with it. They exhausted about half of the thruster fuel that they had kind of set aside, and they just said, "Nah, I'm gonna give up on this." And they definitely succeeded in later missions with rendezvousing and eventually mastered it, which was part of the purpose of doing the mission, which was to perfect, not doing this mission, but the purpose of the Gemini projects to master rendezvous and docking for the Apollo mission. Uh, because Gemini was created as sort of a spin-off of Apollo. 7 months after Kennedy announced Apollo and the goal of landing a man on the moon, they decided to create the Gemini project so that they could master having multiple astronauts in space and doing EVAs, doing rendezvous and docking, having astronauts in space for an extended amount of time, because up until that point they'd only been up in space for hours. Russian astronauts had definitely been up for a few days, but Americans really hadn't been up as long as, say, a Gemini 4, which ended up being a 4-day mission. Uh, you'll note that on this capsule, I don't have a launch escape system like I did on the Mercury missions. That's because it didn't have one. Apollo did have a launch escape system on the Saturn V launch vehicle on top of that, but the Gemini missions, they chose to have ejection seats. So they would just, the hatch would pop and they would kind of get ejected out of the spacecraft if there was any problem. So I could be going back to having to create an LES on the Apollo missions in the future, but for now I'm kind of exempted from that because KSP doesn't have ejection seats yet. Maybe that's something that they'll add in the future, but you can see that I kind of got pretty close because I'm actually pretty decent at docking. You can see that chase camera. I switched to chase camera pretty early. Chase camera helps a lot when you're trying to dock because it lines up the translation and the rotational controls with what's on the screen more or less. So if you're hitting, say, the I key, you know that that's gonna fire the upper thrusters. So I gave up on that, and here I am going around to get into my third orbit to do the EVA. During this time they pretty much just got ready for the EVA, and the astronauts they originally planned to do the EVA on the second orbit, but the astronauts, especially I believe McDivitt, were pretty stressed out and tired from the initial beginning of the mission and the failure of the rendezvous attempt. So they decided to delay it until the third orbit. So they ended up doing the EVA right over, I believe, the western coast of the United States. So I think that I pretty much achieved that in KSP, kind of the western coast of the Kerbal Space Center continent. So I sent both of my Kerbals here out on an EVA. Excuse me, I got a little bit of a cough still. And they obviously did not have these, no, maybe not so obviously, if you're not aware of NASA and space history. They didn't have these jetpacks that our little Kerbals have. They were tethered to the spacecraft still. They basically just depressurized the cabin and opened the hatch, and then they were tethered via a tether line that was both like a physical line of contact and also like their oxygen supply. And to maneuver around, to give them like pitch and yaw and all that control, because since you can't really, there's no air to push off of, they had a little gun that had pressurized oxygen in it, and they called it, I think it was a zip gun, and they held that in their hand, and they used that to yaw over and to maneuver around outside of the spacecraft. And they actually had a lot of problems while they were outside of the spacecraft. They had, up until that point, they had used push to talk on their radio, which was basically you push a button and it's like a walkie-talkie. You push a button to talk, and then the ground used push to talk kind of. They decided for this mission to switch it over to what they called Vox, which was just basically voice activated uh, radio, and it didn't work very well because they had to be in push to talk mode to actually have the ground controllers, which was for the first time in this mission was Houston. You know, Houston, we have a problem. They used the Houston Mission Control Center for the first time, so they had major problems with actually keeping the ground on the loop, and they were getting towards the end of where ground control really wanted their EVA to be, because similarly to what you can see here, they were approaching nighttime and they didn't want that EVA to extend into nighttime. So finally they switched their radios back into push to talk mode, and basically Houston was kind of freaking out and saying, "Get back in the capsule, you need to get back in right now." And they wanted to stay out longer because they were having a you know, not a I don't want to say like a great time, like they were fooling around outside of the spacecraft, but they thought it was amazing to be doing an EVA and floating around freely. So they had a problem getting the door open, and you can see I'm having a problem getting my Kerbals back over to the hatch. But they had a problem getting the door open, and it just so happens that one of the astronauts, I believe it was McDivitt, uh, they had that problem while they were testing it in the vacuum chamber. So he went to one of the technicians, and he actually made the guy show him exactly how the hatch lock worked, and they figured out together what the problem was. So when the exact same problem happened when they were trying to get the hatch open while they were in space. So thankfully he knew how to open it and also how to close it back up when they got back into the spacecraft. So it could have been a huge problem if they either hadn't been able to get out to do the EVA, or they had been able to get out to the EVA and they couldn't actually get back into the spacecraft, because it's a major problem if you can't close that hatch back up, and then you've got all that re-entry heat getting in, and it would have been they probably would have died in space, which would have been horrible for both them and the American space program. So now I'm just accelerating forward in the orbit. They actually did 62 orbits, but I'm not going to do that. Like I said before, I'm not going to make you guys watch that. Sometime around, I believe, the 48th orbit, their flight computer failed, which was unfortunate for them, but it was also unfortunate for IBM, because IBM made that computer, and they had not a commercial, but an ad in the Wall Street Journal that was bragging about the fact that their computers were so reliable that even NASA used them. And then here they go, and the computers straight up just failed while they were towards the end of their mission. So they had originally intended to do what's called a closed loop reentry program, which basically meant that the computer was getting input from sensors on the capsule, and then it would adjust its attitude and so on based on that input. So because the computer failed, they had to do an open loop uh, uh, program, which is basically just a straight up algorithm for doing any sort of thing. So whereas if you had, let's say, lawn sprinklers, if you had a lawn sprinkler system that just said, okay, I'm going to go on at 5 o'clock p.m. every day, no matter what, that's going to be open loop. Because even if it's raining, that lawn sprinkler system is going to go on. But if it was closed loop, then it would be, for example, it's going to have a sensor on it that measures the moisture of the soil, and it's only going to go on if the moisture of the soil goes below, 5% or whatever. So they basically had to go back in the atmosphere in the same manner that the Mercury capsule did, which was with an open loop reentry system. Excuse me again. Originally, they had the original intent of the Gemini missions was that they would not come back in the same way that the Mercury missions did, which was with drogue and main parachutes and so on to slow them down and then fall into the ocean with a launch bag to keep them afloat and all that. But rather, they would use what was called a Rogallo wing, which is more or less like a flexible parachute type wing. So if you've ever seen those like ultralights that look like they're kind of like a go-kart that's attached to like a hang glider, that's most of the time that'll be a Rogallo wing. And they eventually just decided against that. I guess that they figured that it was impractical, and they already knew more about landing with the parachutes, and it was simpler, so they went with the Mercury and Apollo in the future style re-entry and landing. So here, the only reason I made this many revolutions was because I wanted to wait for it to be daylight on like the eastern kind of Kurlantic Ocean there to the east of KSC. So now I'm just rotating around retrograde, and I'm about to fire those retro boosters, those Separatrons, and it doesn't really turn out that well because even though I put all those Separatrons on there, I'm not sure how many there were, probably what, 12 or so. Um, you can see here that it does not lower my orbit enough, nearly enough. And I could have just started over and said I'm going to put more Separatrons on there, but they get so heavy. I mean, I've said before in my previous videos that they're surprisingly heavy. I think there's something like a tenth of a metric ton, or a tenth of a mass unit. I didn't want to put any more on there, so I just that's why I ended up putting those. You can see them there, those RCS thrusters on the bottom to slow me down even more. So I use those to degrade my orbit even more. I figured that's kind of acceptable cheating, just because I didn't want to have to create an even more wobbly and unstable rocket. It was getting to the point where I was tempted to even cheat further when I was adding on fuel and to use boosters, because the sort of series staging just was not working out. Just it was horrible. Originally I had the three-man Bill Bob and Jebediah crew, and now I've got these scrub guys because so many of them died on the launch pad because the spacecraft was falling apart and just kind of like pancaking into itself. So this is my final re-entry here. Uh, I kind of tried to overshoot the distance a little bit, as far as like what you saw on the trajectory, to sort of end up on the map at that like continent that you can see there, and because I figured that aerial drag would kind of slow me down. There's the rendezvous and reentry section undoing itself, decoupling itself, but the parachutes didn't go out because I wasn't quite at the right altitude. I kind of thought I kind of guesstimated the altitude, and you can see from the parachutes deploying there that it wasn't quite right. So it would have been way cooler to see, but we can kind of imagine that off in the distance they're deploying. And then you can see that I wasn't slowing down nearly fast enough because I didn't deploy those parachutes until I was pretty low. So I'm going to end up actually landing over land as well. But it's for a reason. It's for a reason. I have an excuse for failing you guys so utterly. It's because I wanted to explain that one of the other purposes of the Gemini missions was to prepare for one of the goals of Apollo, which was to specifically land in a given geographical or nautical location, because they were much less accurate with the Mercury program, because they really didn't they had a pretty wide area where they knew that the capsule was going to fall. So they in the Gemini missions they really sought to kind of to narrow down where that landing location was, which is part of the reason why they use the sort of closed loop reentry system. And here I was kind of using RCS to see if I could maybe push the capsule over, and then you can see the bottom just kind of fell off. I wasn't intending that, but it kind of looks kind of cool. So we're gonna end up landing there, because going back to the reentry system, if you know anything about the way that like an autopilot works, the ASAS is kind of like an autopilot, and that's a closed loop control system. So it's a lot more accurate. It's a lot smarter than just saying, thrust here no matter what. You can be a lot more accurate. So that was kind of a prelude to the better systems that were on Apollo and even today. Because obviously all of the systems today are closed loop rather than open loop systems. So there you go. I landed not too far from the ocean. My Kerbals are no longer terrified, and that's pretty much it. The next time I'm probably going to be moving on to one of the Gemini missions that actually did docking, either with another Gemini capsule, or possibly, I'm not sure, with a blah with a Rendezvous target vehicle. It was called the Gemini target vehicle. So we'll see which one I pick to do. It's going to be a lot quicker to come out than this video. Thanks for watching. Have a safe time flying in Kerbal Space Program. Bye.